In the summer of 1767, London believed it had solved the American problem. Parliament thought it had found a safer way to draw money from the colonies and a firmer way to hold their governments in line. Townshend's duties looked moderate. They were meant to be accepted quietly. Within 3 years, they would collapse in repeal and leave 2,000 soldiers occupying the city of Boston. On June 29, 1767, Parliament approved the Townshend Revenue Act. It placed new duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea entering American ports. Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer, sold the plan as an external tax, a duty on trade that colonists would swallow more easily than the internal stamp tax they had just forced Parliament to repeal. He expected about £40,000 a year. More than the money, he wanted the principle, a clear assertion that Parliament could tax America for revenue. The duties were only half the design. The revenue would pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in America first, with any surplus going to colonial defense. That single change cut deeper than the taxes themselves. For decades, colonial assemblies had paid those officials directly, and a governor who needed his salary, voted each year, tended to listen to the men who voted it. Now, London would pay him instead. The assemblies were about to lose their oldest source of leverage over their own rulers. Parliament passed the measure with little debate. To most members, it looked like a reasonable middle path, neither abandoning taxation nor returning to direct internal taxes. Townshend insisted the colonists themselves had drawn the line between internal and external taxes during the Stamp Act crisis. The distinction was far too neat for the constitutional thinking taking shape in America. In September of 1767, only weeks after his duties became law, Townshend died suddenly. The program would outlive the man who built it. The Revenue Act never travelled alone. Parliament paired it with machinery designed to stop the smuggling that had gutted earlier taxes. New Vice-Admiralty courts would try customs cases without juries, taking the verdict out of the hands of local men who tended to side with their neighbours. And a new American Board of Customs Commissioners, seated in Boston, would run enforcement directly. It carried the power to issue writs of assistance, open-ended warrants to search private property for smuggled goods. The duties fell on goods the colonies needed and could not easily replace. Tea carried 3p a pound, and Americans drank far too much of it to quit. Paper reached every printer in the colonies, so every newspaper in Boston suddenly paid more to publish. Glass and paint struck a building trade in full expansion, and merchants, builders, and homeowners felt the increase almost at once. Lead, used for ammunition and a dozen trades, was just as hard to do without. Townshend had chosen well. A boycott this time would hurt the colonists nearly as much as the Crown. At the dockside, the rules tightened. Captains now had to file detailed manifests before unloading, with heavy penalties for a single false word or an undocumented crate. Officers could seize a ship and its cargo on suspicion alone, and in the Vice-Admiralty courts, the merchant, not the Crown, had to prove his innocence. The commissioners decided for themselves what goods were worth and what duty they owed. A system built for strict collection had just handed enormous discretion to the very men who profited from collecting. The board began work on November 8, 1767. 5 commissioners, Henry Holton at their head, with Birch, Paxton, Robinson and Temple, answered to the Treasury in London, not to any colonial governor. The arrangement kept the board independent of colonial assemblies and removed its costs from British taxpayers. Each man drew £500 a year, paid straight out of the customs receipts he was sent to collect. Seizures and successful prosecutions generated rewards throughout the enforcement system. Its reach ran the length of the coast, from Halifax to Charleston. New officers arrived, more inspectors, more searches, more paperwork, and more chances for a merchant to make one costly mistake. The board could appoint and remove officers, reopen old cases, seize vessels, reward informers, and call in naval ships or troops whenever it wanted them. For colonial traders, enforcement was no longer an occasional inconvenience. It had become a permanent part of doing business, a standing imperial bureaucracy on American soil, built to extract revenue and answer only to London. The program reached past the Customs House. In New York, the Assembly had refused to fully fund the Quartering Act, voting money for the troops, but leaving out mandated items like salt, vinegar, and the soldiers' liquor ration. London read the partial compliance as defiance. On July 2, 1767, the New York Restraining Act received royal assent. It barred the Assembly from passing any law at all, no road repairs, no debt collection, nothing, until New York obeyed the Quartering Act in full. The threat carried across the colonies. Parliament had just shown it could suspend an elected assembly altogether, not merely fine it, but stop its government cold. New York had already spent over £3,000 on the troops, proof it would support them on its own terms. But the Restraining Act demanded total submission, turning a quarrel over supplies into a test of who held power. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania passed resolutions of sympathy, carefully worded, so as not to invite the same punishment on themselves. By early 1768, the combined weight of duties, courts, the Customs Board, and the suspension of New York began to pull the colonies together. On February 11th, the Massachusetts House approved a circular letter, drafted by Samuel Adams and James Otis, and sent it to every other colonial assembly. The tone was loyal, not defiant. It laid out Massachusetts's objections to the Townshend duties and called for united petitions to King George III. But the act of writing to the others was itself something new. The argument was familiar. Taxation without representation violated the rights of British subjects, and 3,000 miles of ocean made real representation in Parliament impossible. What was new was the audience. For the first time, one colonial assembly had invited all the others to resist together. The dispute was no longer local, it was becoming continental. Massachusetts approved the letter by a vote of 92 to 17, and from that point, the colonies were no longer protesting one law in one port. They were learning to act as one. The letter did more than complain about taxes. It warned that suspending an assembly, as Parliament had just done to New York, threatened representative government everywhere in America. It named the burden of the new duties, the Customs Board now seated in Boston, and the writs of assistance that let an officer search a man's property without cause. And it returned to the salaries, the revenue meant to pay governors and judges and pull them out of colonial hands. A loyal petition on its face and a coordinated challenge underneath. In Boston, the new system ran straight into crowded wharves and powerful merchants. On June 10, 1768, sailors from the warship Romney seized John Hancock's sloop Liberty at the wharf. The commissioners had watched the ship since it arrived from Madeira, certain Hancock had landed wine without paying duty. A tidesman named Thomas Kirk had filed no complaint at the time, then changed his story, claiming he had been locked below deck while the wine came ashore in the dark. On Kirk's revised account, the officials acted. The Romney's crew cut the Liberty's cables and towed her out under the warship's guns. It happened at dusk, as dock workers and sailors crowded the waterfront, and the sight of British sailors dragging off a famous merchant ship lit the fuse. The crowd swelled into the hundreds and began pelting the customs men with stones and clods of dirt. Comptroller. Benjamin Hallowell and collector Joseph Harrison ran through hostile streets. The mob chased Harrison to his home, smashed his windows, dragged his pleasure boat to the common, and burned it. Hallowell's house was battered too. the officials and their families fled to the Romney, and within days the commissioners abandoned the town for Castle William out in the harbour, leaving customs collection in the busiest port in North America effectively dead. Boston's own magistrates read proclamations and pleaded for order, but the crowd would not break until it had emptied its anger on the enforcement it had endured for months, the writs, the seizures over technicalities, the fees that merchants called plain extortion. Governor Francis Bernard wrote to London with a blunt admission. Civil authority in Boston had collapsed, and the duties could not be enforced without soldiers. The Liberty Affair raced through the colonial press as a symbol of imperial overreach. London already had its answer prepared. In October 1768, British regiments landed in Boston. The town became an armed camp. Nearly 2,000 soldiers filled the streets, standing guard while customs officers tried once more to collect. Troops quartered in Faneuil Hall and other public buildings, and officials called it simple protection after the Liberty Riot. Parliament had set out to collect a tax. It had ended by occupying a city. For ordinary Bostonians, the army was not an abstraction. Sentries challenged men on their way home after dark. Drums and morning drill on the common cut through the working day. Soldiers and dockhands traded insults in the taverns, and a single careless word could end in a brawl. Apprentices threw stones at the patrols, and mothers kept their children indoors. The town and the troops now lived pressed against each other, and every small collision left a little more anger behind. The occupation bred friction by the day. Off-duty soldiers took dock work at wages local men could not match, stacking economic resentment on top of political anger. To London, the troops upheld parliamentary authority. To Boston, they were proof that government by consent had given way to government by force. And the soldiers changed nothing that mattered. Into 1769, colonial juries still refused to convict the men charged under the revenue laws. Behind the politics, the system reached individual men by name. A cooper who mislabeled a barrel, a shopkeeper caught with undeclared cloth, a mate who signed a faulty manifest, any of them could lose a season's earnings to a single seizure. The law rewarded informers with a share of every condemned cargo, so a man could profit by turning in his neighbour. Trust frayed along the waterfront. The Townshend system did not only tax the colonies, it set them watching one another. So the colonies answered with their ledgers. Through late 1768, merchants from Charleston to Portsmouth bound themselves to non-importation, refusing British goods until the duties fell. Philadelphia joined on February 6, 1769. New York backed its pledge with committees of inspection that named violators and enforced the boycott through public pressure. What had begun as a Boston tactic was becoming a continental discipline. It held unevenly. Charleston signed on but exempted certain plantation goods, while Virginia's House of Burgesses went further, voting in May 1769 to ban British imports outright, proof the boycott had climbed from the merchant's counter into formal politics. The rules travelled faster than the ships themselves. Committees inspected vessels, searched warehouses, and printed the names of anyone who broke ranks. By early 1769, the pressure reached across the Atlantic. Colonial imports of British goods fell by about a third, and London merchants began petitioning their own parliament for repeal. At home, the boycott turned into a movement. Families wore homespun, and women organised spinning bees to make the cloth Britain would no longer sell at a price they would pay. It was never perfect. Smugglers, exemptions, and quarrels over profit strained the agreements in ports like Newport and Baltimore. Even so, the resistance held its shape. By late 1769, every major port kept some bar against British goods, and every dispute led back to the same structure. salaries paid from duties, courts that sat without juries, and a board in Boston that could search and seize at will. The Townshend system had not answered the question of who governed America. It had only kept the question alive in shipping papers, in courtrooms, and in streets where soldiers and townspeople met every day. By early 1770, Boston still lived under occupation. Then, on March 5th, came the shooting on King Street. The town moved from shock to action within hours. A town meeting overflowed Faneuil Hall and shifted to the Old South Meeting House as the crowd neared 4,000. A committee led by Samuel Adams confronted Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson with one demand: every soldier out of Boston. Hutchinson tried to give ground slowly, offering to withdraw only one regiment. The committee refused, and the crowd refused with it. Adams returned with a warning that the countryside would march on Boston if the troops stayed. Colonel William Dalrymple judged withdrawal the wiser course, and Hutchinson's own counsel told him to yield. That afternoon, Hutchinson agreed to move both regiments to Castle William. The 14th marched down King Street to the Long Wharf on March 10th, and the 29th followed the next day. By March 12th, the regulars were gone from Boston proper, with only a garrison left at the castle. They had been driven out not by an army, but by a town meeting. In London, 3 years of duties, enforcement costs, and lost trade had worn Parliament down. On April 12th, 1770, Lord North, now leading the ministry, pushed through a partial repeal. The duties on paper, paint, lead, and glass were struck off. The accounting was embarrassing. The cost of the commissioners, the patrol ships, and the staff had run higher than the revenue they had managed to collect. But Parliament kept the tax on tea, 3p a pound. That was deliberate. King George III wanted one duty left standing to assert the right to tax, and North agreed. The tea duty would bring in perhaps £12,000 a year, but its real purpose was to remind the colonies who held authority. Some members feared that full repeal would invite further resistance. The partial repeal eased trade, but settled nothing. It took effect on December 1st, 1770. The Customs Board kept operating, and the tea duty stayed on the books, the enforcement machinery still planted on American soil, even as the other taxes fell away. The Townshend system ended in retreat, but it left behind a structure and a principle that neither side would give up, and it left soldiers in the streets of Boston. The occupation had already produced its defining moment that winter on a stretch of frozen ground called King Street, where 5 men fell and 8 soldiers were charged with murder. What happened that night, and the trial that decided their fate, is the story of the next chapter.